All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out this morning, and I think we've got a great morning here in the pavilion. I'm going to remove this a little bit. It's just more comfortable for me. So, I'm like that band you go to see who will never play the hits. Like they just want to play their new stuff. I've got something totally different for you today, a new project that I was working on that I thought might be interesting to some of you, the freest towns in America. I was inspired to do this by a book manuscript I'm working on, and it's not going to be part of the book, but it was inspired by it. The working title of this book is Little Leviathans, How Government Grew and Sometimes Shrank in the American States. And it's basically an overview of the history of freedom at the state level since 1900. And so I look at, income and sales tax adoption, school finance. I've got something on how states actually voluntarily, a lot of them removed racial segregation before the federal courts got involved. A little known story. I've got something on state mandatory sterilization programs and contraceptive bans, and I'm going to have a chapter on the Free State Project, actually. So that manuscript should be done in a couple of months, and you should look for it once it goes through peer review and all that sometime next year. But one of the themes that comes out of this is that we've really seen a decline in local autonomy in the US. So back in 1900, over 60% of the taxes that we paid were paid to local governments, and about 25% to the federal government, and the rest to state governments. So state governments were actually really small and kind of unimportant back in 1900. And that changed a lot. So today, local governments now make up only about 20% of our total tax burden goes to local governments for the average American. So local government has really declined as an important area for taxing and spending, and state government has really increased. So state governments have grown. We've seen this decline of the local. And so I use Bob Higgs' crisis and Leviathan model, his ratchet model to understand government growth, to look at this at the state level. And I actually modify it a little bit. I don't think it completely works, but his whole idea was that government takes advantage of a crisis when people's attitudes have changed. And when people's attitudes change toward, well, government is the solution in a crisis, that government takes advantage of that crisis to grow. And then once the crisis is over, it never shrinks back all the way to where it was. And so you get this ratchet effect where government keeps getting bigger. And so I do see some of this at the state level in the US, and we see some big evidence of state level growth at times like the Great Depression. But I also find that we see freedom triumph sometimes when public attitudes change. And so we've seen that with personal freedoms. We saw that over the course of the 20th century. We're seeing it now with marijuana legalization at the state level. And so I'm also trying to understand why that happens, because it doesn't fit that crisis and Leviathan model. So what I'm finding here then is I'm really looking at, okay, at the local level, why has this declined so much? And is it good or bad? And my claim is going to be that at the local level, it's good if local governments are the place where we do taxing and spending and any public services you want to have. If that's done more at the local than the state level, that's a positive thing. But when local governments start getting involved in regulations, when they start regulating your land, when they start getting into criminal justice, that ends up being a negative thing. So, the freest towns in America. All right. What I was curious to do then is to look at places around the country where you have the most freedom from state and local interference. And so I've got basically two criteria I want to look at. Okay. So when identifying the freest towns in America, I want to look at first your tax burden. Okay, so there are some taxes you just can't avoid paying. Income taxes, like everyone needs income at some point or other, right? So income tax is something you can't avoid paying. Sales taxes, you're going to need to buy things to live at some point. It's not a tax you can avoid paying, a general sales tax. All right, so general personal income and sales taxes, I want to look at no or very low levels of those. And then finally, property tax, right? Because if you want to own your own land, you're in most places, with a few rare exceptions, you're going to pay property tax. So I want to look at the places that have really low tax burden in those three areas. And maybe they tax some other things that you don't have to buy, like rooms and meals or alcohol or weed or things like that, right? And then I'm going to look at, can you do what you want with your land? So do you not have any really significant zoning regulations that limit what a kind of normal person would want to do with your land? Okay. So in some cases, maybe you'll have regulations on, like, if you want to drill for oil, then maybe there's some regulations on that. But if you want to just like build houses on your land, you want to have like a family compound, you want to log or whatever, if you want to farm, I'm looking at, as a normal person, can you do what you want with your land, and can you get away with paying no or very, very low taxes? All right. So right away, we're gonna limit our search here, because if we're gonna look at places that have no income or sales taxes, then we're gonna eliminate 48 states right off the bat, because 48 states have either a sales or an income tax, or more typically both. All right, so those definitely cannot have the freest towns in America. It would be another interesting exercise to look at the freest towns in each state, but way beyond what I'm able to do right now. So Alaska and New Hampshire, right? These are the two states that don't have a general sales and income tax. So these are the places where you might see free towns. Okay. So New Hampshire and Alaska, they don't have general sales or income taxes. Or how do they get their revenue? Well, if you live here in New Hampshire, you probably have a good idea. I see some legislators in the audience. We get some revenue from taxing rooms and meals. Okay, but if you live here, you're not going to buy a lot of lodging. You can make your own meals, right? You can avoid that tax. We get a business enterprise tax, which ultimately falls on the worker, but businesses are the ones who actually pay it. So if you don't have a business, you're technically not paying that. A business profits tax. So those are the main taxes in New Hampshire. Alaska gets a lot of revenue from taxing oil. So that's fortunate. If you live in Alaska, I'll tax oil consumers around the world. Effectively, that's what an oil tax does. Both states tax alcohol, cigarettes, and gasoline. So it's hard to avoid paying for gasoline, right? You got to drive sometime. But you can also sort of kind of think of the gasoline tax as a user fee, right? The more you drive, the more you pay, especially if gas taxes are used to fund the roads. So if you set the gas tax aside, Alaska and New Hampshire are the two states where it seems like you might be able to avoid paying taxes altogether. All right. Now, at the local level, both Alaska and New Hampshire have property taxes, but there are many places in Alaska that don't have property taxes, and a few places in New Hampshire that don't have property taxes. Now, in Alaska, local governments sometimes do have sales taxes, so we're going to have to eliminate those too. Typically, the rates are pretty low, but they're high enough that they're going to not end up on this list. Let's talk about zoning. So in New Hampshire, you have over a dozen jurisdictions that don't have a zoning ordinance, but most of them have some other kind of land use regulation. So they might limit your ability to subdivide your land, or a town like Grafton says you have to have 2 acres per house that you build. So they technically don't have zoning, but then they have this restriction on your land use that affects an ordinary person. So that counts. So it's not maybe a huge deal in Grafton, a very rural town. Land is cheap, but it is a restriction. A handful of jurisdictions here in New Hampshire really have no significant land use regulations at all, including some that are in close driving distance of this campground. In Alaska, the entire state land area is subject to zoning. I was a little bit surprised by this because you think Alaska, it's so rural, right? You have huge tracts of wilderness. Why are they bothering to zone these areas? It's just state law. The entire area is zoned. However, when you dig into it, you do find a few places in Alaska that zone some of their land as general use. And when you look at that, it means you can do anything you want, right? So we technically have zoning, but you can do anything you want other than maybe like big oil rigs and maybe like big mining projects, all right? And a lot of these areas are still subject to things like subdivision ordinances, but I found that those don't necessarily regulate the amount of land you need for a house. So if you don't want to subdivide your land and record a new lot, right, if you just want to build like multiple homes on your land, maybe for family members, you can still do that without a subdivision. Some uses can also require a special permit, and that requires a public hearing. Like if you want to do a large-scale commercial business, like open a Walmart or something, then you might have to get a special permit. If you want to do adult entertainment or sell weed, you might have to get a special permit in some of these places. But again, for a normal person, if you just want to build a house, do some farming, that kind of thing, these areas don't have really any regulations. Okay, so if we put both of those categories together, taxes and zoning, are there any places in America where you can live free from state and local taxation and do whatever you want with your land? Okay, and the answer is yes. So let's profile some of these towns. All right, so coming in at number 6 in my list, it's a town from New Hampshire, Pittsburg, New Hampshire. How many of you have been to Pittsburg here? A few of you. It's a very pretty town. It's at headwaters of the Connecticut River. It is the largest town by land area in New Hampshire. And it was once the independent Indian Stream Republic. So the entire territory of this town was in an area that was once disputed between Canada and New Hampshire. Actually, the British Empire in New Hampshire. Canada wasn't independent then. And so they wrote their own constitution and governed themselves as an independent country for several years until that a treaty settled that they were part of New Hampshire. So Pittsburgh is number 6 on this list because it does have property taxes, but they're extremely low, and it has essentially no land use regulation, so you can do whatever you want with your land. Among places with 800 or more people, Pittsburgh is the only place in either New Hampshire or Alaska that lacks both land use regulation and a normal tax burden. Okay, so there's your hint. All of these are really tiny places. There are no cities here. These are tiny, tiny places. Of course, there are extreme outliers here with no tax burden and you can do it, no land use regulation. You're not going to find that in cities. I mean, if you want to find out which city has the most economic freedom, there is something out there by a guy named Dean Stansel, Metropolitan Economic Freedom Index, and you can check that out. But yeah, this is like hardcore, right? No taxes, and no land use regulation. It's going to be some weird places. All right, so in Pittsburgh, you can build whatever you want, wherever you want. There's no zoning ordinance, there's no subdivision ordinance, there are no site plan review regulations. Of course, if you did try to build a private city in Pittsburgh with tens of thousands of units, I bet they would, enact some regulations pretty quickly. So, there's an issue of scale here. But if you just want to do a few things on your land, it's no big deal at all. And that's probably true of any of these places, right? You try to start a private city anywhere, government's going to pay attention to that and probably do something with it. All right, now, considering that, that housing is really affordable in Pittsburgh, it's remarkable that their tax rate is only $9.60 per thousand. So I went on Redfin. I saw a 1,500 square foot home on 3 acres listed at 400,000, and a really nice brand new build 1,700 square foot home on 8.5 acres listed at 500,000. All right, so it's an affordable town. By today's prices, that is really cheap. So on that $500,000 house, which by the way costs less than the average home in the entire state of New Hampshire, and this is a state that has lots of really old homes, you'd pay $4,800 a year in total taxes in Pittsburgh if you had that $500,000 house. All right, total taxes, of course, they're the feds, okay, but state and local, $4,800 a year, and you could do whatever you want on your land. So it's hard to find a tax burden that low, even in Alaska. Now, in some years, Alaska does pay you to live there. Right? It's got this permanent fund dividend from its oil revenues. Okay, eventually that's going to run out. Alaska's oil production has peaked, so there is that. New Hampshire won't actually literally pay you to live here. We don't need to do that. People want to live here anyway. But the tax burden is super, super low in Pittsburgh. Okay, that's our number 6 town. And actually, I want to go through some photos as I do this. I grabbed, so there's a location in New Hampshire. We're in Coos County right now, and you can see it's the northernmost part of the state. And, you know, the Connecticut lakes, very attractive. Classic North Country. Some of these places, I ended up grabbing stuff literally off Google Street View because these are so remote, as you're going to see. Pittsburgh is not. You see lots of pretty photos there. Indian Stream Republic on the bridge. Just, you know, I wanted to grab some photos of where human habitation is, so you get a sense of like what the neighborhoods, to the extent there is any human habitation in some of these places, what they look like. All right, number 5, our very own private town in New Hampshire, Hale's Location, which is a very interesting little place. It's on this list because it's a fully private town with no public land use regulation at all, and its property tax rate is tiny. It's just $3.88 per thousand. All right, so a third of Pittsburgh's. However, it is more expensive to buy there because it's the whole thing is a private golf community. That's what it is. So it's a nice place. There are other private towns in the U.S., but you'll pay sales or income tax in all of them, and probably a lot more than you'd pay here in property tax. Of the towns on this list, this is the one that's probably most realistic for people in this room to move to. Here's where it is. It's that little tiny red dot. It's in Carroll County there. So it's just south of the White Mountains. It's kind of abutting the White Mountains on that kind of southeastern shoulder. It's right next to Conway. All right, so if you've ever driven through Conway, you know how much traffic there is, especially in summer during ski season. So lots of amenities, like a 5 to 10 minute drive from Hale's Location. All right, there's a hotel there, it's the White Mountain Hotel. And so here's a nice aerial view of Hale's Location. You can see the golf course. And there's this charismatic cliff that looms above the township. This is, Hale's Location is considered an unincorporated area. There are a few of these in New Hampshire. In Coos County, there are a lot of unincorporated areas, but they are zoned by the county. In Carroll County, the county has no zoning authority, so Hale's Location has no zoning. Another view of the cliff and the hotel. Nice place to stay. Olga and I went there last year. Here's your golf course. You know, you can see some homes here that are on the golf course. These are not cheap homes. But you'll still probably end up paying less in property tax here than you would even in Pittsburgh. Think of it, you buy, let's say an 800K house, and you're paying $388 per thousand in property taxes. Your property tax bill is going to be super low. All right. What else do I have to say about Hale's location before I move on? Okay, so the other thing is you will pay homeowners association fees. Because there's the Hale's Location Owners Association that manages the entire land area of the township, and they'll regulate what you can do with your land. But it is private, right? So it's voluntary. So in a sense, it belongs on this list. But it's only number 5. So we're going to get some even freer locations here. All right, here's Denali, Borough, Alaska. And I'm particularly looking at all the areas in this borough. A borough is the equivalent of a county in Alaska. And it has some cities within it, but really it only has one incorporated city, the city of Anderson, which has some taxes. But if you look outside the small city of Anderson, there's no direct taxation. No property tax, no sales tax, no income tax. Zoning restrictions are limited unless you're doing something big. It's mostly general use. The population of this entire borough, which is where Denali National Park is located, is 1,600. It is remote. Hence why there aren't many good photos of places where people actually live. There's where it is, right in the middle of Alaska. It's a big land area there. I don't know how many Hale's locations could fit in there, but probably in the thousands. It is the famous location of Chris McCandless's bus. If you've read Into the Wild, right? Isn't that the name of the book and the movie? It is located in Denali Borough, like 3 miles off the highway, actually. And so there it is. There's a river that kind of runs through some of the populated areas, and so you get some pictures of. There's actually a brewery, a brew pub, right outside the the national park. So there's not nothing there, not literally nothing. I wanted to get some photos of just like where people live, and people live in things that look like this. The housing there, a lot of it is prefab. I mean, we're talking remote Alaska here, so a lot of like metal siding even, and vinyl siding, and metal roofs. It's pretty mountains though. Airport. The only way to get there is to fly in. So it's very important that there's an airport. Fly Denali. So I love flying on these little tiny planes. You can fly out of these in Lebanon, New Hampshire too. It's great. Loud though. All right, number 3, a place called Newhalen, Alaska. Population about 160. It is part of what is called Lake and Peninsula Borough. All right, so I couldn't even find a map that actually had its borders, but I just dropped a tag showing you where it is. So it's actually not near the coast. So again, it's a place you need to fly to get to. It's on a lake. Some parts of Lake and Peninsula Borough have taxes. Newhalen is one of the places that do not. It looks like there are unincorporated areas in Lake and Peninsula Borough where you wouldn't have taxes, but it's not clear to me that anyone actually lives there or that any of it is privately owned. So I can only be confident that Newhalen is an area where there's some privately owned land and you don't pay taxes. So if you get into the hinterland here, you will find privately owned land where there's no local government to worry about at all. The entire population, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the area of Newhalen has 160 people. The area lacks extensive zoning restrictions. If you want to do large-scale commerce, then you have to get a special permit. But again, if you're not doing that, you're just building some houses, doing some small-scale commercial stuff, you don't need any permission. The population of Newhalen is mostly indigenous, so Alaskan natives. There is a restriction here that moves Newhalen down to number 3, which is that alcohol and marijuana may be consumed only within someone's home. So it's actually illegal to have bars or restaurants that serve alcohol. You can possess it, but only in your home. There's a neighboring town called Iliamna where the airport is, and there's a lodge that caters to fishing tourists. Apparently some of the best fishing in the world, and from what I can tell, it mostly looks like this. It's hard to find evidence of humans unless you get pictures of the airport and the fishing lodges. More pretty mountains. Trout and salmon fishing is what attracts people here. But even the tourist numbers are really small. It seems like they've enhanced the green on this photo. It's just so green. That's not very green. But from what I can tell, this is where the types of residences that people actually have. Just like homes scattered here or there, somewhere along a dusty highway. All right. Moving on. By the way, Newhalen, Alaska, the one downside there, it has, of all the places in the US Census, it has one of the very lowest per capita incomes in the United States. So it's an extremely poor place. But maybe your dollar goes a long way. I don't know. The unorganized borough of Alaska. This unorganized borough technically has no local government. That's what it means that it's not organized. There's state government and then there's you. There's no county or town between you and the state. And it's massive. It's all of this area. And almost no one lives in the vast majority of this. Parts of the unorganized borough have incorporated towns. Okay, and those incorporated towns actually do tax in a lot of cases and do regulate your land use. And that's where most of the population lives. Okay, so to really live free of taxes and land use regulation, you've got to get out of the incorporated towns and into the Alaskan wilderness. All right. The entire population of this area, which could fit the region of New England, is 80,000. So to get outside even the incorporated areas, and villages with as few as 100 people are frequently incorporated as cities. All right? So Alaska has dozens of these second-class cities with like 100 residents. So you are getting into, at that point, the remotest part of Alaska. Now the state does zone all this land, technically. It's state government that zones it. But outside a couple of housing developments, this is zoned into the general district, which means that so long as you aren't doing large-scale commercial activities, like commercial mining or timbering specifically, the state doesn't care what you do. You could build houses, sell houses, farm, log, whatever you want to do, unless it's a really large-scale logging. You pay no taxes to state or local government if you live in the Alaskan wilderness. The Iditarod, that famous dog sled race, runs through the western part of this area, largely. It starts out near the coast and then runs up the western part here. So, it looks like this. I mean, really, I'm just pulling random stuff off Google here to find, what's an area that's outside, that's not incorporated in this vast wilderness of Alaska, and there aren't many photos. There's somewhere along the Iditarod Trail. Some highway in the eastern part of the unorganized borough of Alaska. So there is a highway that cuts through the eastern part of this that goes into Yukon territory. So there are some actually road links to the outside world if you're in the eastern part of the unorganized borough. In the western part, you have to fly in. Some attractive wilderness. There's a post office. This is a post office in the census-designated place of Circle. Circle, Alaska. Not incorporated. So if you live here, again, you pay no taxes, basically no land use regulation. In the western part of the area, again, as I mentioned, you have to use airplanes, snow machines, or dog sleds to get to most of the towns. Along the Yukon border, you do see highways and you can drive through. If you live in one of the rural education attendance areas, that's what they call them. So if you do have kids, got to send them to school, according to the state of Alaska, even if you live way out away from roads and stuff and use snow machines to get here and there. You send your kids, you're eligible to send your kids to public school. And the state will pay for your kids' education even though you don't pay any taxes. And so this has become actually a political issue in Alaska. So they know this, they know that people living out here, it's extremely expensive to transport their kids to school. And extremely expensive to maintain these small schools. But the state does it at the expense of the state treasury, even though you don't necessarily pay any taxes if you live there. All right, that was our number 2 area. And number 1, freest town in America, Livermore, New Hampshire. All right, so where is Livermore? Population 2. So it's the very smallest of all of these places by population. And it's here, it's in Grafton County, where I used to live, and where David's parents used to have a summer house. But it's over the eastern part of Grafton County. It's off the Kankamagus Highway in the White Mountains. And it used to have a logging population. It actually used to be an incorporated town. It's now an unincorporated part of Grafton County. Grafton County, though, does not have zoning authority, so there's no land use regulation in Livermore. Most of Livermore is White Mountain National Forest, about 90%, but there's a sliver of private land. As I mentioned, only 2 people lived here at the last census. The tax rate is 0. You don't pay income, sales, or property taxes, and there are no regulations on your land. So it maxes out on all dimensions here of freedom. It won't stay that way, of course, if kids move there. Then the state will start assessing at least a state part of the education property tax. For now, Livermore, New Hampshire is the only place in the U.S. where you could move and have essentially nothing between you and the federal government, right, in terms of taxes or land use regulation at any rate. As I mentioned, Route 112, the Kankamagus goes right through here. The Sugar Hill Scenic Vista is a favorite photo spot, so it's quite scenic. So, we love fall in these parts. Here's the scenic vista. You can take in Livermore from your car. There are ruins here from the old timber town. So if you hike the Sawyer River Trail, it will take you past the ruins of the ghost town. The economic base in the late 1800s and early 1900s consisted of logging and a sawmill. The mill closed in 1928 after a flood cut it off from the railroad. And there's an old mansion. There was an old mansion here, and you can still see the the foundation of the railroad. So that in the back there, this photo is from the late 1800s. In the back there's the Saunders Mansion. After the town was abandoned, it gradually was deteriorating and sometimes, unfortunately, getting vandalized. So the owner intentionally burned it down in 1965. And here was a photo shortly before it got burned down. Okay, a little bit more actually about Livermore. So who lives there? There are these two people living there. A family called the Shackfords own a cabin there. NHPR did a story on them some years ago when their family claimed to the census to be living there. This is back in the 2000 census. So they actually only stayed there during the summer, but a census person showed up and they said, yeah, we live here. It was kind of a joke. And so at that time, the population was 3. But that was 24 years ago. So, so what's going on now? Who are these two people who live there? Maybe they've made the cabin their year-round abode. In the story they talked about, hey, we want to actually live here year-round. So again, it's estimated about 10% of the land here is privately owned. So call up the Shackfords, get a plot here. You know, they can sell it to you without any regulations, and you can live tax-free with no land use regulation in Livermore, New Hampshire, the freest town in America. Thank you. Olga.
Are you gonna make me move to Livermore?
Maybe Hale's location. I mean, we both like Hale's location, right? Any other questions?
So, let's say I buy a plot from the Shackfords.
Yeah.
New Hampshire has a state building code. If I wanted to comply with that, who the hell would enforce it?
No one. There's no building inspector. And actually, there are a lot of towns in New Hampshire. Technically, there's a building code, but there's no building inspector. So it's kind of effectively a voluntary building code. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk, Jason. You mentioned one of the towns is a private town. Can you explain what that means? And also, following up, what prevents a bunch of libertarians, free state people from going to one location, buying up a bunch of land, declaring it a private town, maybe seceding from the outlying town?
Yeah, actually, the state legislature authorizes town secessions. The last time this happened was 1962, I want to say, when Sugar Hill seceded from Franconia. That's where Polly's Pancake Parlor is, if you've ever been there. It's a nice stop on your way home from Porkfest. So yeah, it's definitely possible to secede and form your own town. The other thing you could do is, you know, I mentioned all these unincorporated areas in Coos County that don't show up on this list because Coos County zones them. Coos County would no longer zone them if they were incorporated. So a lot of that land is owned by timber companies, population 0. But if you bought some of that land, developed it, lived there, petitioned for incorporation, you could then choose to have no land use regulation and no property taxes, and you would rival Livermore as the freest place in America. So it's a possibility, yes.
I know there have been several attempts by people in the FSP to get together and buy up a piece of 50 acres or something and put a bunch of small houses on it and whatnot. And I am always told that the issue is that they run into the town says, oh, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. Why not? Like, why can't, I'm sure there's one of these counties, like you just said about up near Livermore or whatever, where we could just buy a piece of land and whatever we have to buy it through some sort of, you know, LLC or something or nonprofit, whatever, to buy the piece of land and then put up, say, 20, 30 tiny homes and actually be able to have a community.
Yeah, or regular
stopping us
homes
from
for that
doing
matter. Yeah, so zoning regulations are what normally prevent that, that require no more than one residential unit per lot. So you'd have to get subdivision approval. And then you'd have to obey whatever the dimensional requirements are. You need X number of acres per house and that kind of thing. You could go through those steps. It's somewhat costly and time consuming. But in some of what's that?
You were talking about Livermore, like how would they enforce that?
They would enforce, so Livermore is a place where you could just do that. And actually a lot of the towns that don't have zoning in New Hampshire, you could just do that. So in Pittsburg, you could just do that. And you could maintain it as a single lot. And in fact, there may be some advantages to doing that, having, say, a corporation own the lot, because then, yes, it's nice to kind of build equity in your home, but if you build equity in the corporation, isn't it kind of the same thing? One of the advantages of that is that the corporation has every incentive to maximize the value of that land. So if any rules are needed, if any improvements are needed, right, the corporation has every incentive to do exactly the right rules, do exactly the right improvements that will benefit the overall property value. Homeowners associations, where you have lots of individual homes that then vote kind of democratically to elect a government, like a private government that sets the rules and fees and things. That doesn't work quite as well because I'm just one part of the entire community. I don't necessarily have the incentives aligned to favor maximizing the value of the entire community in the way that a single owner would. So if you want to learn more about this theory of how to design private communities, there's some work by some libertarian thinkers. One book is called State, Market, and Alter, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but then his grandson wrote a book called The Art of Community. And so they were kind of libertarian anarcho-capitalists who wanted to figure out, well, how do we actually structure private communities? And they've been heavily influential on some of the free city efforts in places like Honduras. So anyway, you could do that now. Like you could set up, so long as it's small enough and doesn't activate the locals to say, now we want zoning, you could get together 20, 30, 40 people, build a bunch of homes on a single lot, and be autonomous in a sense.
Well, what I'm saying is that, like, I've been told that these efforts have been shut down. Why, if it's that simple, why haven't we done it yet?
Well, in part because some of these places are really freaking remote.
That, as they say, that's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, right. So those of us who have fully remote jobs or are retired, yeah, we could do that. So of a potential interest to some people, for sure. Other thoughts on the freest towns in America? All right. Thanks very much for having me.